The Roman Colosseum. The air vibrates with a roar that blends jubilation and fury. Thousands of voices shout in unison, while on the arena floor, the ground is stained red. Men fall, chains drag, swords clash, and amid this chaos, one figure rises above all, Demetrius, the Lion of the North. For 3 years, no one could defeat him. His name was synonymous with fear for the gladiators and hope for the cheering crowd. But the story you are about to hear is not one of his glory, it is the story of his deepest humiliation. Because Demetrius' greatest battle did not take place with a sword in hand, but against a far more dangerous enemy, the obsessive desire of the most powerful man in Rome, Emperor Nero. How could the most undefeated gladiator in history end up a prisoner of an emperor's desire? You will discover it in the next few minutes, and what you learn will reveal just how far corruption can go when power knows no limits. Long before his name thundered through the Colosseum, Demetrius was already a warrior. He was born in the mountains of Thrace in 40 AD, the son of a tribal chief who had fought for decades against Roman expansion. From a young age, his life was marked by iron and discipline. He learned to wield a sword almost as soon as he could walk, and his body was forged in the harshness of war. He was a man of imposing stature, with muscles sculpted by training and battle. His blonde hair and blue eyes, rare among the Thracians, earned him a nickname that would later echo throughout Rome, the Lion of the North. But even lions can be betrayed. In 61 AD, during a campaign against the Roman legions, one of his own men sold the location of his camp for gold. The ambush was brutal. Demetrius fought like a demon, taking down more than a dozen legionaries before being trapped in the nets and spears of hunters sent to capture him alive. Roman custom dictated that a rebellious leader be executed without delay. But that day, something different happened. The soldiers who captured him were so impressed by his valor that, instead of killing him, they sold him to a man who saw not an enemy, but a goldmine, Lucius Aurelius Commodus, Rome's most prestigious lanista. Commodus knew how to recognize the raw material of a champion. He invested fortunes in Demetrius' training, placing him under the guidance of the empire's finest instructors. And Demetrius, combining the ferocity of his barbarian roots with refined Roman techniques, became a living legend. For 3 years, his name was synonymous with spectacle, strength, and absolute dominance in the arena. But his meteoric rise did not go unnoticed. From the heights of imperial power, someone was watching closely. Someone whose admiration would soon turn into Demetrius' downfall, Emperor Nero. At first, the relationship between Nero and Demetrius seemed harmless. The emperor, who considered himself an artist and lover of beauty, was captivated by the gladiator's presence. He claimed to see in him the perfect union of strength, harmony, and power. He did not watch the fights from the imperial box, surrounded by senators and nobles, but from private balconies, hidden in the shadows, studying every movement, every gesture of Demetrius in the arena. His servants claimed he spent hours talking about him, describing him as a living work of art. He ordered the best sculptors and painters in Rome to depict him in marble and on canvas. His image began to fill the halls, rooms, and gardens of the palace. What initially appeared as simple artistic admiration soon became something darker, a morbid obsession. Nero no longer saw Demetrius as a gladiator, not even as a man. He saw him as something to possess, a personal treasure, an object that existed solely for his entertainment. And when an emperor's desire mixes with absolute power, the result rarely ends well. What began as art would soon become the greatest nightmare of Demetrius' life. All of Rome awaited that day. On July 15, 64 AD, the Colosseum was filled to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Nero's rise to the throne. Among parades, spectacles, and sacrifices, a special event had been planned, the public trial of Demetrius, falsely accused of conspiring against the emperor. It was a sham. Nero himself had invented the accusation, but he sought not justice, he sought a spectacle that would push human endurance to its limits. The sentence decreed was his execution in the arena, to face 5 gladiators at the same time. The crowd expected to see the undefeated fall. But what happened exceeded all expectations. Demetrius fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. With each move, the arena turned red with blood, bodies fell, and the roar of the crowd became a sepulchral silence. One by one, his enemies were defeated until finally only he remained, covered in sweat and wounds, but still standing, his sword raised toward the heavens. And then something unsettling happened. Demetrius raised his eyes, and they met Nero's. From the imperial box, the young emperor watched him with a mix of ecstasy and delirium, as if he were beholding not a gladiator, but a divine creation made solely for him. That gaze was the true sentence. That very night, Demetrius was summoned to the palace. He believed his victory had earned him freedom, or at least the emperor's recognition. He walked toward the imperial chambers convinced he would receive a reward. But instead of laurels, he was met with nets, chains, and the ultimate trap that would change his destiny forever. Nero's private chambers on the Palatine Hill were a monument to opulence, marble, tapestries, exotic perfumes, yet that night, everything seemed like a trap disguised as luxury. Demetrius was received not as a champion, but as prey. The Praetorian guards carried not swords, but nets and chains. Within seconds, the Lion of the North was immobilized, caught as if he were a wild beast. Confused, he demanded the freedom he had earned with his blood in the arena. Nero, with a smile full of venom, replied that he had never intended to release him. His fate was not to die, but to be transformed. The emperor did not want a gladiator, he wanted a living trophy, a symbol of power he could shape at his whim. From that moment on, Demetrius's glory was stripped away and replaced by systematic humiliation. He no longer fought for the masses in the Colosseum, but for a small audience, the emperor's inner circle. There, in private arenas designed for Nero's personal entertainment, Demetrius was displayed like an object. He was forced to fight naked, facing battles not to honor his strength, but to highlight his vulnerability. Instead of a hero, he became part of a macabre theater where his dignity was the spectacle. The most terrible part was not the physical pain, but the invisible wound. Nero sought not to destroy Demetrius's body, but his spirit. He wanted to break the undefeated warrior and turn him into something worse than a slave, a living reminder of what he had been and could never be again. The arena, once his kingdom, became his prison. And the Lion of the North, who had once made Rome tremble, now roared silently under the chains of an emperor who saw in his suffering the most exquisite form of entertainment. For Nero, everything seemed under control. He had reduced Rome's most feared gladiator to a mere object of private spectacle. He believed he had broken his spirit. But what the emperor did not understand was that the mind of a true warrior cannot be chained. Demetrius, in the solitude of his cell, began to forge a new kind of strength, one that did not depend on the sword or the arena. Every night, before sleep, he closed his eyes and mentally returned to the mountains of Thrace, to the rivers where he had trained as a child, to the battles where he had fought alongside his people. Those memories became his refuge. He created silent rituals. Before each humiliating combat, he would take a deep breath and repeat to himself that he was not the slave Nero wanted to display, but the warrior he had always been. And so, even amid the emperor's staged spectacles, he kept his identity intact. But he was not alone. Other mutilated gladiators and palace slaves began to notice his way of resisting. They saw how Demetrius, though forced to obey, kept his gaze steady, never fully yielding. Gradually, that attitude became a beacon of hope for the others. A network of silent resistance was born. There were no weapons or open conspiracies, only gestures, looks, and small shared rituals. A nod in the arena, a deep breath in the corridors, a memory whispered quietly. Unwittingly, Demetrius became a symbol of dignity in the face of oppression. What Nero had tried to use to destroy him ended up planting a spark of invisible rebellion within his own palace. And that spark, in time, would ignite into a fire that not even the cruelest emperor could extinguish. While Demetrius resisted in silence within the palace's depths, the Roman Empire was beginning to fracture. Legions in Hispania, Gaul, and Africa rebelled. The Senate, tired of the emperor's excesses, began plotting in secret. The city murmured. Rome no longer saw Nero as a leader, but as a tyrant out of control. Yet, in the midst of this political storm, Nero seemed oblivious. He retreated into his private spectacles, obsessed with perfecting his masterpiece with Demetrius. He even planned one last act of cruelty, a final combat in which the Lion of the North would have to fight against all the palace's mutilated gladiators until only one remained, to then be publicly executed as the grand finale of his reign. But history did not give him the time. On June 9, 68 AD, the Praetorian Guard, until then loyal to him, turned against him. The Senate declared him a public enemy, and the troops advanced on Rome to capture him. Cornered, Nero fled the palace. Unable to face the humiliation he had so often inflicted on others, he chose to end his own life. His last words, according to accounts, were, "What an artist dies with me." A phrase that perfectly summed up his narcissism until the very end. With the emperor's death, the invisible chains that had bound Demetrius and many other slaves began to break. The prisoners were freed. The empire had changed hands, and with it, the life of the gladiator Nero had tried to claim forever. Nero's death did not immediately erase the scars he had left behind. Demetrius was released along with the other prisoners, but his freedom came with an invisible weight, the memory of every humiliation, every moment he had been reduced to an object of entertainment. The new emperor, Galba, granted him a modest villa on the outskirts of Rome and ordered veterans to care for him, men who understood well what it meant to carry the traumas of war. There, far from the arenas, Demetrius found relative peace. But although his body was tended to and healed as much as possible, the deepest wounds were those that no doctor could cure. The mind of the Lion of the North remained marked by years of oppression. It was often said that he spent hours in silence, staring at the mountains as if he could still see his native Thrace. He died in 74 AD, officially of natural causes. He was only 34 years old. Those who knew him said that, in truth, he died from the invisible wounds Nero had inflicted, wounds that never stopped bleeding in his spirit. Yet his life was not only a tragedy. His silent resistance, his refusal to surrender his dignity even in the worst circumstances, made him a symbol of something greater, proof that the human spirit can survive even when all seems lost. The story of Demetrius and Nero is much more than a dark episode of the Roman Empire. It is a mirror of two opposing forces, on one side, the boundless cruelty of absolute power, and on the other, the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. Nero believed he could possess everything, the body, the glory, and even the soul of a warrior. And though he succeeded in humiliating Demetrius, he could never take away the essential, his inner dignity. Because true freedom is not always measured in broken chains or crumbled walls, sometimes it is measured in the ability to remain oneself, even when everything around you seeks to destroy you. Demetrius died young, marked by tragedy, but his legacy endures. His life is an eternal warning: power can break bodies, but it can never completely destroy the essence of a man who refuses to surrender. And that is the lesson that transcends the centuries. Even in the darkest moments, there is always a way to resist in silence. What do you think? Do you believe inner dignity can be maintained even in the worst circumstances? Share your thoughts in the comments and share this video so more people can discover this story. And if you haven't already, subscribe to keep exploring together the most shocking secrets of ancient history.